Hello and welcome to Barnyards and Backyards Live. Our regular hosts, Jeff and Jeremiah, are unable to be with us today, so I am going to be one of your hosts. My name is Abby Perry. I'm an extension educator with the University of Wyoming. Also with me today as a host is Jenny Thompson, who's our Small Acreage Outreach Coordinator. And then our guest today is Brian Lee, who's a research scientist at one of our research stations. So welcome both of you.
All right.
All right. All right, Brian, do you want to kick us off?
Oh,
Sure.
I just wanted to mention before we start, I mentioned it for folks that are on Zoom. If you have a question, feel free to type it into our Q&A box or the chat box, and we'll see what we can do. This is streaming out to Facebook Live as well, so if you have a question, you can type it in as a comment on Facebook Live. We'll be monitoring that and bring back into the conversation. Thanks. Go ahead, Brian.
Okay, we'll jump right in. Thank you, Abby, for introducing me, and thank you, Jenny, for having me on. The topic we're going to be discussing is this idea of raising your own freezer beef, and we're going to go through some of that process and the costs associated, and if it's worth it. So if you are interested in making that decision, hopefully we can help you with that. We are also going to talk a little bit about what happened during at the beginning of the COVID pandemic with beef supply and beef prices a bit, and explore what happened as kind of a precursor to this idea of potentially producing your own freezer beef. And we will link a paper that pertains to this. Jenny noticed a paper actually a couple of years ago that was getting a lot of hits on the internet. It was a popular paper, but a lot of the numbers were outdated. So Jenny asked us to rework the paper, add updated prices for beef and feed and everything. And so we did that, and that's kind of where we're at. But that was in 2018, so probably about ready to redo it again. A lot of those numbers actually haven't changed significantly to date. They would have been very different at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, but now we're about actually where we were even last year. So price of beef and stuff. So
that's pretty interesting that changed so much and it's come back already. I would have thought it would have taken a longer time.
Yeah, that's what makes it so interesting it's just a blip on the radar, but it was very, very significant. So I'm going to start sharing. I think, let me know if I don't grab the right screen.
Okay.
Okay, that's not the right screen, is it? Oh, there it is. All right.
There it goes.
So
get a preview.
Yep, there we go. Okay, so freezer beef and what happened at the beginning of the pandemic. So this idea of freezer beef, basically, it's the idea that you buy a steer or a heifer animal and you feed that animal with the intention of having it processed, and then that is your primary beef source for your family. So instead of going to the store and buying hamburger and steaks, you've raised that your own, and it's in your deep freeze. It could be a 4-H project if you've got your kids that are interested in getting into that, or some other educational opportunity. One of the benefits is how that animal is raised. If that's one of your concerns, you can finish that animal how you see fit, if that is a concern for you, which to a lot of people it can be. It can be a fun family experience. Part of what we see a lot at the research center, we host a lot of student groups, and one of the things we try to really push is understanding agriculture and where our food comes from. We host third grade students almost yearly, and we do a potato program, and we just ask the kids, do you know where your food comes from? You know, how many of you have had, you know, an ag product to eat today? And they, you know, so that's part of our mission too, is we want the next generations to understand food and food security and, you know, healthy food. So
Yeah, I know a lot of people, they have it with kids and they raise an animal in part to give the kids the experience of the responsibility of taking care of the animal and how that all works along with being part of the agriculture and the food process.
yeah, I mean, how valuable are those organizations that, I mean, the whole goal is to help these kids and students have some responsibility, understand the world a little bit better. So it's, I mean, they're so valuable. So and then what we're going to look at is it cheaper to raise your own animal, your own beef animal, rather than buying individual packages of meat from the grocery store? So we'll kind of end up there and discuss from there. So part of the reason that you might be interested in producing your own animal or raising your own animal is all this uncertainty in the retail market. And we saw that at the beginning of the COVID pandemic. We saw it on the news. There were runs on grocery stores that, you know, the only meat left was, well, meat was, you know, tofu burgers or whatever at grocery stores, and people were scrambling to find meat because there was this uncertainty, and so maybe that has pushed people to look into this idea of raising their own beef. So meat security, when that happened, there were a lot of people out there kind of panicking. Where am I going to get my meat or my beef that I am so used to having? So I want to look a little bit about what happened, because it's very interesting what happened in the markets starting in late March up to now. And so Abby can help me with the economics here, but
before we get into that, I just wanted to mention we had a comment on the Facebook that said that most people don't understand how much corn per day it takes to finish an animal, which is part of the process too. And I just wanted to mention that Brian's going to talk about the various economics that have occurred with the COVID and everything that happened there. And then we're going to get into more of the exact costs of how much it takes, not only in feed, but in equipment and other things that to finish out an animal.
Yeah, I just kind of want to do some background work to kind of reiterate what happened and why there is maybe so much interest in freezer beef now. But yeah, we're going to break down the costs of kind of an example freezer beef and go through just kind of a general example that then you can start there, and maybe you've got a neighbor that happens to, you know, have a space for you, or you can reach a corn deal on or something. But I mean, every situation is going to be different, but we're just going to do like kind of a general example. So,
sure.
So yeah, at the beginning of the pandemic, packing plants didn't need as many cattle due to decreased production. They had increased expenses and other things they were trying to deal with. They were trying to contain COVID outbreaks in their operations, so they decreased production initially. That means not as much meat was hitting the marketplace, meaning that retailers had to pay more for their supply. They had to compete with other retailers, then passing that price on to the consumers. The marketing margin, which is considered the boxed beef prices, so that's the value of an animal coming off the production line minus the live cattle prices, saw a huge increase. And the last time an increase of that size happened was last year, when a Tyson plant burned in Holcomb, Kansas, which took out, I think the last number I saw was 5 to 6% of the processing capacity in the U.S. So, and this spike was huge compared to that one. So, the major packers were trying to contain outbreaks. They were putting in safety resources for their workers just so they could try to keep operating. And so producers that had cattle ready for processing at that time had problems placing cattle because the actual amount of animals going into processing facilities had decreased quite a bit.
I just want to add, so my husband cuts wild game in the hunting season and has a little tiny facility, but can't do domestics. And when all of this first started happening, we were getting call after call after call after call of people trying to get those, cattle or pigs or whatever processed. So we were even seeing that on a very localized, small level.
Yeah, and that kind of reiterates this push towards people maybe being interested in trying to process animals. Yeah, and I know you've probably heard it in your areas too, but we keep hearing rumors that as soon as basically you think you want to process an animal, you better have a place for it reserved, because small processors are so far booked in advance that because the demand is so great. So. One thing kind of on that, Abby, we talked about yesterday, I talked with Jenny. One thing I kind of see maybe happening out of this is more specialization of these smaller processors. If there is turnaround time going from wild game to cattle or hogs, I could see these small producers really specializing on one species just to try to do away with that turnover time. That's one thing I could see happening in the future, or people going away from wild game altogether or specializing in wild game if that's where they think their premium's at. So
Right.
it'll be interesting.
I think in the processing plant, you have to keep at least in Wyoming, have to keep your domestics and your wild game separately. So if you're in a small facility, you can only do one or the other at a time. So like right now during hunting season, you can only process those wild game animals. And so, yeah, I could see where having that backlog or that switching back and forth isn't really an option.
Yeah, that's one thing. I guess we'll see what happens, but I could see that happening. So, so again, just to kind of to look at what happened, you can see. So this is cattle on feed. So animals that are getting prepared to go to a processing facility, and we can see about the middle of March to April that number dipped significantly. And we're talking, out to beginning of the year at 12 million head, which was roughly on par with what it was last year. But this is a huge gap right here that, nobody saw coming. But as I mentioned, about the middle of June, July, we're back on our average from last year, or our price, our number of head from last year. So hard to say what the long-term ramifications of that are going to be or were, but I mean, as of middle of June, we were roughly about the same as we were the year before. And then another interesting chart, so this was fed cattle marketing. So cattle that were coming out of feedlots that had somewhere to go to be processed. For whatever reason, there's a typical dip in February. You look at that from the average of 2013 to 2017, there's a dip in February. There was in 2019. We saw it again this year. And then back up to almost 2 million head at the end of March. And then that absolutely fell off And we're looking at, over 500,000 head difference from last year to the end of April right here. So pretty incredible numbers when you're talking, just over 2 million head, and you take away 500,000 head of that cattle that are being marketed. So just incredible numbers.
So these were animals that had a place to go, but then when all of this happened, no longer had a place to go. Is that?
That's the way I understand
Okay.
that graph. Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting.
And then along those same lines, so this is looking at animals that went through packing facilities. So these were commercial slaughter facilities, and then these are federally inspected slaughter facilities, and they're about the same number. But in April here, we dipped to 78% of the previous year's numbers. So 78% of how many animals went through those facilities the year prior. So you can see that supply chain was significantly impacted, which is why we saw increased prices through April and May, and even a little bit into June. And then that transferred, like I said, to those increased prices. Looking at the end of April through May, beginning of June, looks like May 16th. You can see, so these are box beef cutout values. So basically the value of an animal coming out of a processing facility. That's kind of how they track it, how they track the value of animals. But our retail prices basically, or our wholesale prices were over double what they were a year ago. And I think a lot of people saw that. I mean, how many people went to Sam's Club or even the local place and said, man, there's, price of 80/20 ground beef is, $15 or whatever it was. And it was just unreal. So, so that being said, one way, if you're interested to maybe not have to go through this again or worry about your food security, would be to think about raising your own freezer beef. And like we said, we'll link this paper that you can check out yourself, but just going to go through some of the costs and the numbers of what, roughly what it would take to raise your own animal, if that's something you're interested in. So
great.
Brian, are these numbers similar? So not everybody has a place to, have an animal, but if you were to have a rancher raise a beef for you and then buy one from them, do you think that the cost would be similar, or is this really just for on your own place?
So it's geared at, it's you and your family,
you doing it yourself,
buying one animal, and you put a fence up yourself. And so I think if you had somebody that had space and they finished an animal for you, I think those costs would be a little bit cheaper, honestly, because they can buy corn in bulk and buy, have the vet and come do all the animals at the same time or whatever. So
okay,
economics of scale, right?
yeah. So, and already have the facilities in place, already have, tanks in place, and
sure.
So
okay.
So we consider this family or this person purchasing an animal, and I believe in the paper we said they purchased an animal sometime in October, and that animal is, I think we said, how big was that animal, Jane? Do you remember?
Let me see. I'll look it up real quick. I have it pulled up. So For those of you that are watching, we have the paper that he's talking about was an article that occurred in the Barnyards and Backyards magazine, and it came out in winter 2019. It was an update on one we had done previously. So it says as of October 2018, the market price for a 750-pound steer is about $160, 100 weight.
Yeah, so that animal is about 750 pounds, and you buy that from somebody you know, a neighbor or whatever, with the intention of finishing that animal out.
Mm-hmm.
So things that we need, and you already kind of hit on this, Abby. We're going to need somewhere for this animal to essentially live for the next 200 days. So we need some facilities. So part of our so Jenny mentioned our cost of our initial steer, we estimate to be $1,200. Our startup is what is going to be our fencing supplies, our whatever shelter we establish if we want to for this animal, our water, which can be a tank, can be a tank heater. So things that we would consider kind of infrastructure. And so this might look really cheap, right? $68. I'm thinking, oh man, that's a good deal. So this is actually prorated, but we considered it over 7 years. So with the idea being, if you put up a good enough fence, you buy a quality water tank, you take care of it, those facilities, you shouldn't have to do much maintenance to them for 7 years, maybe a little bit of maintenance, which would be figured into this cost. Say you have to go, replace a piece of, one piece of wire or put a new T-post in or something. So those costs are prorated over 7 years, thinking that they should last at least 7 years. So we spread that cost out over 7 years.
Makes sense.
The next thing, and we'll go into it a little bit deeper on the next slide, but we have to feed this animal. And if we want this animal to be well marbled, fat when we come out, the typical process is to feed it grain, which we consider a mix of corn, oats, and barley, or commonly called COB if you're going to go buy it at the local mill. That's common practice for finishing an animal, to fatten an animal up.
So you might start out on mostly hay and then you'd gradually work into more grain. Is that right?
Yeah, that's what the paper considers. So to kind of normalize the diet of the animal, they're started on alfalfa, and then the alfalfa tapers off over the course of feeding, and the grain load is ramped up over the course of feeding. And we'll talk about that in the next slide. But so that's all in that feed cost. We also considered, it would be great if every animal we ever had never needed to see a veterinarian, but unfortunately that's not the case. Everybody knows that. Everybody has, an animal that got into something or got injured and needs assistance, and we need to, treat that animal right. And so we considered in the paper an average cost of a $200 vet bill, which could be an extra shot, could be getting patched up if we said got into an extra pile of fencing supplies and got its leg scraped up and needed to be doctored. Could be anything. But so, maybe 1 year you get lucky and that animal has absolutely no vet cost beyond what's normal. So, this is just, we're trying to put some basic numbers together. And maybe you can do it cheaper than this. Maybe this is way too cheap for what you think is normal, but this is a place to start. So
when I was reading the article, I sort of chuckled as I was thinking, all I have for livestock is chickens, and they get themselves into pickles. So I can only imagine what kind of pickle a steer gets itself into. So yeah.
So So yeah, and then our last major cost that we considered is our processing fee. So we're assuming this animal is going to a local meat locker, and this is another cost that this cost may, and maybe Abby has some insight to this, but I haven't checked recently, but I would imagine this cost could be more expensive now, um, or at least may increase in the near future. But we considered the processing to cost $750.
Mhm. And folks also need to think about what they're going to do with the meat after they get it home. So if you don't
Yeah,
already have a freezer, yeah, or a couple freezers, you're going to have to
yeah,
think about that as well.
and my neighbor has an appliance store, and he said the first thing that sold out in March and April were deep freezes.
I
Yep.
bet.
Our local, since my husband's a processor, he's been trying to track down freezers, and our local place isn't getting them in until November.
Yeah,
And then I also have a friend who manages a Walmart, and he was talking about people like making purchases online. So they weren't even, getting to the floor of the store. People were just watching on the internet. And as soon as it showed it on stock, they'd buy it online, and it wasn't even making it to the floor of the store. So yeah,
yeah,
freezers were in high demand.
yeah. So yeah, that's a very good point, Janie. Better be prepared to have room for a beef, because it's, yeah,
Have
and
some
we
very nice
consider,
friends with freezers.
yeah, and we're talking, we consider you're yielding 500 pounds off of this animal. So think about it like you go to the store and buy individual 1 pound packages of hamburger. Okay, take that times 500. That's how much room you're going to need. So
Mhm.
yeah, definitely be prepared.
Mhm.
So yeah, I guess that's part of this, not the not an issue, but part of the process of doing it this way. So
Mhm.
okay, so on to our feed. Um, so we're feeding this steer free choice grass hay for roughly 200 days. That amount is going to vary. So right at the very beginning, we're feeding this animal more grass hay, and then we'll back that ration off as that animal starts to gain weight, and we want to finish that animal. So we, over the course of, so basically down here, we will feed a total of 300 pounds of grass hay, roughly 15 pounds a day. So one
3,000
and a half,
pounds, I think.
yep. So 1.5 tons, and we consider we bought that grass hay for $145, which I don't think is too far off for prices right now. But so we will feed some grass hay to that animal over the whole course that we have it. So 3 months out from processing, which we considered to be early June, is when we are kind of thinking about taking that animal to the processor. So 3 months before that, which would be March, I guess, March, we start adding grain to the mix to try to fatten that animal up to get that nice marbling and fat into the muscling of that animal.
Also changes the taste, right?
Yep, yeah. And so, and you know, there are other ways to finish animals. We've all heard of grass-fed beef, and other if that's what you want to do with your animal, you're I think that's totally possible. The finishing the animal is going to take longer though, so that's why adding grain to the diet can finish an animal quicker. So we start by adding 5 pounds of grain in addition to the hay to that animal about 3 months out. And we consider this to be if you go, like I said, to the local mill, they'll call it COB, corn, oats, barley. And I found a local price of about $16.50 per bag. And those come in, I think, 100-pound bags. Yep, 100-pound bags of grain. So, and then that grain component of that diet gradually increases throughout those last 3 months until he's eating roughly 18 to 20 pounds per day and about 5 pounds of hay up at the very end. So if we do that, we follow that ration, our feed costs should be somewhere around $440. Now, that's going to vary based on what kind of connections you have, what you decide to feed it, how long you decide to feed it. Maybe it's a really good gainer and you have to take them in early, or you want to start them later, or whatever. So, but that's just a rough estimate based on, local numbers that we could find.
It looks like there was a question too about the percentage ratio for total weight versus processed weight.
Okay. Yeah, and we can talk about that a little bit. I assume they're talking about yield of the animal.
Sounded like it to
I
me.
think so.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And again, in our paper, let's see.
So in the paper, we talk about the percentage of cuts that you get off of an animal. I don't know if we talk about the...
I think that a beef carcass efficiency is around 50%, but I don't,
right.
I think that that's pretty close.
Yeah.
It probably depends on the animal and some different things, I would think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so I just had that. We consider that animal when it's ready to be processed. We considered it at about 1,100 pounds. Now, every small producer has a scale at home that can go to 1,100 pounds. So that should be very easy to tell when that animal's ready. I actually looked up and I was like, well, what can I compare that to? If somebody's going just off of pure weight, a bull shark weighs 1,100 pounds, and also a baby elephant. So
go to the zoo, check it out.
Some good side-by-side comparisons.
Use that as your gauge. No, but you could always employ somebody that has idea of when an animal should be finished. We described it as the animal's carrying noticeable fat covered over ribs and hips, and that is a good indication that animal is going to be ready.
And so in this example, we talk about 1,100 pound animal and it returning about 500 pounds of cut and wrap beef.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So it goes back to that question.
Yeah, and that's at a yield, and Abby said 50. We considered 60% yield, and so that the actual hanging carcass would have been 837 pounds, and then the actual pounds of meat or yield of meat is we figured 500 pounds off that animal. So, and then of that meat, and we looked at a lot of resources to kind of look to see if these numbers were correct, but of this meat, roughly 30%, or we considered 150 pounds, will be higher in cuts. So steaks, loin cuts, things that we would pay pretty good money at in a retail location. And then 70% of that is going to be hamburger. A lot of that animal is going to be hamburger. And then a lot of roasts, and what are considered lower end cuts, things that would be cheaper in the supermarket. So 350 pounds of lower end, 150 pounds of higher end cuts. And that's pretty typical, I think, of a lot of animals. So with that considered, in our total cost, we figured at $2,658.25. that seems like a lot when you think about, money on hand to just in our pocket. $2,600 is a lot of money. So you kind of have to look at that we took it down to a per pound price. So if we were to yield 500 pounds of meat and it took us $2,600 to do that, our per pound average price is $5.32 per pound. And that is considered to be the cost per pound for the lower end cuts and also the higher end cuts, which if you go and think about that, isn't necessarily the case, but that's the way we had to do it, because if you're going to go to the grocery store and buy those, the hamburger at the grocery store is probably going to be less than that $5.32, but the higher end cuts could potentially be much more. So as a comparison, we did use retail prices. I used the ag marketing service to find retail prices. And retail prices for lower end cuts can range from $2.77 to almost $8 is what we considered. So that again is going to be ground beef, roast. Retail costs of higher end cuts can range from over $8 to almost $12 per pound. So higher end loin steaks and loin cuts and steaks. So
an individual can basically take your numbers and change them to suit wherever they're at and go to their local grocery or wherever they get their meat from and kind of use those numbers and plug them in here to make a kind of more tailored comparison to what they're looking at. Knowing that things can change, we just saw your graphs about the volatility that occurred at the beginning of the pandemic and the big price changes that happened. But at a more, it probably will have not quite such giant jumps.
Yeah.
As far as we can tell.
Yeah. So you might look at that and say, well, I don't want to pay $5.32 for a pound of hamburger. Well, in effect, that's what you're paying, but not really, because on the other end, you're also paying $5.32 for higher end steaks. That's just the way we had to do it. So we put a comparison in the paper. So if you were actually to go and buy these all separately, so you were to go to the store and buy 500 pounds of meat, and you were going to buy them in the same ratios that you got out of that animal, I figured that it would cost you $3,085 to buy those same cuts. So with that being considered, our difference in raising beef and buying those same cuts at the grocery store is roughly $424 is what we came up with. There are other considerations, like Jenny said. Some people don't want to have a deep freeze. Maybe they don't want to have all that extra meat on hand. It stresses them out to think, well, what if my deep freeze quits and I am out, $2,600? So there are things to consider. But if you know your family is going to eat that much meat, this is, in my opinion, a reasonable option.
It also helps to know what kind of cuts your family likes. So our family uses a lot of hamburger, so we're okay with a lot of hamburger. But your family may be different, and there are different cuts that come off an animal that you may not be quite so familiar with. So you can either see that as a challenge, that you learn how to cook some things that you're not used to seeing, or it may be more of a stressor for you.
Yep. And Abby, this might have occurred to you too, but somebody might say, well, in economics, we talk about opportunity cost a lot. We talk about other things that we could have been doing with our money, or and somebody might look at that and say, well, I produced this beef for $5.32. What could I have done? What could I have done with that money? Prices might have changed over the course of this process. And so this idea of opportunity cost is kind of interesting. But
those
with our,
opportunity costs also include the time, value of your time, right?
yeah, and we don't consider that as a cost across this process. So we consider this a fun activity that you're doing with your family, and I'd say maybe it's a 4-H project, and so your child is learning some responsibility, and maybe they're learning some a little bit of finance in this. You know, maybe they're doing a budget or something. So.
Yeah, they're doing a record book in 4-H. They're thinking about finances as well.
But you know, our intention from starting this process was not to sell any of this meat. It was for our consumption. So that was, you know, that's why, you know, we're able to produce it at $5.32 a pound. So, so yeah, that's, oh yeah. So here I broke it down a little bit differently just to kind of help maybe you picture that. So we produced lower end cuts and higher end cuts at the same price, basically. So those, you know, that then we take that times our price per pound over our lower end cuts, which we have 350 pounds at a what would be a cost of to us of $1,862. Our higher end cuts are going to cost us $700, almost $800. And then if we were going to go to the store and purchase those same products, here's where this price swing really truly makes a difference. So we're buying the same amount of lower end cuts and higher end cuts, but our higher end cuts are significantly more. And that's why, you know, roughly we're getting 350 pounds at the grocery store for $1,500, but we're also getting 150 pounds for $1,500 if we pay retail costs. So that's where that difference is, but just kind of interesting. And that's, yep, that's my last slide. So I got local corn prices or local grain prices, local hay prices, and then you can go and look up what retail beef prices are from the AMS. So that's where I'm at. And that's where our paper is going to be at. It's going to be linked if you want to go check it out. And obviously this is, you can vouch for this, but every person is going to be different. Every person is going to say your father raises grass hay and you can get it cheaper than you can off the market. So, you know, there are a lot of different ways to do it. You've got maybe leftover fencing supplies from another project, or so there's lots of different ways to look at costs, and you know, different ways to produce these animals. So this is a starting point for you to use as a guideline for you going forward. So
great. I just wanted to show folks, I'll pull up here. Oops. I'm going to pull up the website and show you where you can find that article. So this is our Barnyards and Backyards site, and you can see that we have a lot of different information on here, and we have one that's called domestic animals, if you click on that. And so there's information on here on a wide variety of animals, including horses, goats, poultry, and other. But under cattle is where you can find that article on it. And this is what it looks like. And you can just pull that up and print it out or look at it. And like Brian mentioned, you can find out your own prices, like your local prices, and plug them into these charts. And so you can kind of get a better feel for how much it's going to cost and whether it's worth your while if you're interested in kind of the economic standpoint of raising your own freezer beef. And for those of you that want to watch this presentation again, we link them all on our website under this live. If you click on here and you go to the recordings, we'll pull up all the recordings, and we'll do a direct link to that article he was talking about. It'll be linked on here along with the recording of the video for you to look at later. That was great. Very useful information for anybody that's considering doing this as a project and hasn't done it before, or perhaps needs to think through the process again to decide if it's worth it.
Yeah, I think it's just such a timely topic. I mean,
oh boy, yeah.
We all heard and saw people in April and May, you know, trying to find meat for their families. So
all this has really made everybody really think about where their food is coming from and how it's available, and how they can, some folks on how they want to be a little more self-sufficient. I was just going to do some jam on another note the other day, and I was looking in the stores, and they now have like a limit on how many canning jars you can get out, because everybody grew gardens this year and thinking about their food supply, and also just being at home so much more. So Jennifer wanted to thank you for the information. She thought it was great. That's one of our comments on there. So we really appreciate your time, Brian. I've placed in the chat window in the Zoom the link to the evaluation for the show. It also should pop up automatically on your browser when you leave. So, and if you just go through, it's only like 5 questions. If you could just answer them real quick, we use that information to decide how to shape our programs and what to do next. So Brian, thank you so much for your time, and Abby as well. So yeah, go ahead.
Feel free to, if anybody has questions, feel free to reach out. You can find my email address at the end of that article, and also on university websites, along with Abby and Jenny. So
yeah, I was gonna, thanks for reminding me of that. I was also gonna show folks that we have extension offices. If you want to go in and talk to somebody in person, we have different offices around the county. If you want to pop in and discuss this type of project with them, they can give you some ideas and some more information on different topics if you want to chat with somebody in person. So we're out there, or give us a call on the phone as well. Thank you so much, Brian. Everybody have a great weekend.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye.